Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Navigating the New Landscape, How NIST CSF 2.0 Reflects Cyber's Role in Business. My name is Ethan Bresnahan. I'm the Senior Marketing Director here at CyberSaint. And today I'm incredibly excited to welcome Critical Insight founder and CISO. Unfortunately, Padraic, the CyberSaint founder and Chief Innovation Officer, couldn't join us due to a last-minute conflict. So just Mike and I today, but we're so glad that you can join us. And as always, feel free to submit questions throughout the discussion. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you, Ethan. Good to be here. Sorry about Patty, but stuff happens.
It happens. Well, no, I'm honestly very excited to dive into kind of some of these updates around 2.0 with you specifically. I know we've had some very kind of lively prep calls around this topic, so excited to dive in. So specifically, NIST has implemented a slew of changes with the CSF 2.0. Some of the most prominent callouts are the new govern function, the expanded scope, restructured core functions, with a renewed focus on on supply chain risk management. So, Mike, in your opinion, how has the security landscape changed and the needs of the security function changed since the release of 1.0 and 1.1 together? But how has the needs of the security community changed since 1.1 was released in 2018?
That's a good question. Well, a lot of interesting things have happened in the last few years. And I think a lot of this was precipitated by the Colonial Pipeline event. Remember that? Right. And Colonial Pipeline and JBS meets happened about the same time. But Colonial Pipeline affected 45% of the fuel supply in the East Coast. And as we dug into that, we reminded ourselves of this critical infrastructure protection ecosystem that's out there from Homeland Security. And so every critical sector has a sector-specific agency, also called a sector-specific regulatory agency, an ISAC, an Information Sharing and Analysis Center, a sector coordinating council, a government coordinating council, and they're supposed to come up with sector-specific plans for all of the sectors. And I know this because I was on one of the government coordinating councils for state, local, tribal, and territorial governments.
Gotcha.
And what we found out was that the sector-specific regulatory agency for pipelines was the TSA, still is. And as we dug into that, we found out that the TSA really hadn't been given any guidance to pipelines. And so all of a sudden, that snapped all the way to the other end of the spectrum. And now the SSRAs have been regulating, using their rulemaking authority to do that. And what they've done is they've leaned way into a lot of the events that have captured all our imagination. And a lot of those have been supply chain or third-party events, precipitated. Kaseya was one of those. We just saw all kinds of supply chain, smaller ones happen. It looks like now they're going after the really big providers that really have tentacles out there. So these are very targeted right now. So what they're trying to do is lean into some of the big problems that we're having right now. Supply chain security is one of those, but the other one is proper risk management. And when we say proper risk management, what they're really leaning into with this new governance domain is they want you to have risk governance. And so, they move some things out of the identify focus area into this new governance area. And they, as you say, they moved some of the chess pieces around and added a bunch about supply chain security. But this governance thing is something that they really, really are serious about here. And you know that because claims of negligence are starting to show up fairly routinely right now. And in fact, Ann Neuberger, policy advisor of cybersecurity to the president, was talking about the Change Healthcare breach. And we all found out that, hey, you didn't have multi-factor authentication on Citrix. And they're saying, is that negligent? And so what they want you to do is have some risk governance committee that adjudicates the disposition of risks that you identify. And they also want everybody to use the NIST Cybersecurity Framework as your preferred tool because it was really designed for everybody to use. So I think, so to answer your question, they're leaning into the problems that we have, and they're giving you the tools to deal exactly with what they think we ought to be doing.
and just especially kind of button up, this is something we spend a lot of time at CyberSaint talking about. Cybersecurity is a business function, especially with kind of with the addition of governance as kind of a sixth core function of the CSF. To your point, something that jumped out at me was this, again, further kind of integration and kind of measurement and treatment of cyber as any other business function, and kind of the need for that. And that's obviously what we're seeing with this update to the CSF.
Yes.
So you alluded to a couple of kind of major, I'll call them watershed events, being SolarWinds, Colonial. So with all of the, just to double click on that before we move on, with any of these updates, what changes to the cybersecurity landscape in the last 6 years do you think have prompted NIST to make these updates, besides kind of these watershed events? Looking a little bit deeper, obviously, as someone who is very close to the industry, what trends do you think people haven't really spent that much time looking at? What hasn't really been capturing headlines that prompted these shifts?
Well, on the kind of management side of things, when everybody is doing, third-party security, right? And that's just whatever framework you use, whatever, regulatory requirements you have to meet, third-party security is now one of those.
Yep.
And we're very surface scratchy about that. Give me your SOC 2 report and I'm going to call it good. Or give me an assessment by a third party that's against a recognized standard, and we'll just file that away. That's really not good enough. And so now we are starting to really scrutinize each other as business partners. And a lot of that's being driven by the efforts of the federal government to use market forces along with the regulatory authority that those sector-specific regulatory agencies have, so that all of this will cascade down to non-critical sectors. So, for example, if you do business with a company that does business with a company that does business with the DoD, you are required to address the CMMC, right? The Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification, because that's how far they want it to be nth parties. And so, whereas again, we used to be fairly surface scratchy about this, we're all starting to lean more into really an analysis of what kind of risk do you represent to me? Right. And the best guidance I've heard recently, I was talking to somebody about this, and there are services, I'm not going to call them out, not here to sell anything, but there are services that will allow you to give all of your vendors access to a portal where they all input the same information, and then it lets you slice and dice the results so that you can see where risk is concentrated, not so much in a supplier, but a supply, right? So, if we have, whatever you're talking about, our toilet paper supply, whatever. And if that's coming from a very risky supplier who does not score well on our objective matrix here that we use for this, then you better find another one for backup. And so I think that's pretty good advice. So again, with all of this stuff going on with the sector-specific regulatory agencies, that's great for critical infrastructure. They're trying to get this to percolate down. In the federal government's using these market forces to do this along with regulations. So an example of that is the software bill of materials, right? Say, hi, we're the federal government. We are the biggest purchaser on planet Earth. And if you want our business, your software is going to have to meet these specifications, be able to track all the way back to every element in there. So if something goes bad way down that supply chain, again, then you're going to have a problem. So, using market forces, combining that with the regulatory stuff, giving us the tool to use, I think is a pretty well thought through strategy by FedGov.
So there's a lot of rabbit holes that I want to go down based on what you just said. I think where I want to start is kind of your allusion to SOC 2 as kind of a more prescriptive, obviously I would say one of the big flagship value props, or one of the big core elements of the CSF when they first launched it, was this more outcomes-based, less prescriptive type of approach to a framework.
Yes.
As compared to something like SOC 2 or ISO. So I want to touch on, considering the voluntary nature of the CSF, how how do you think the relationship that businesses have to those more prescriptive certificates that you can kind of stand up, whether you're posting it on LinkedIn or kind of waving the piece of paper around saying, we have SOC 2, we have the ISO, whatever it is. How do you think the business's relationships with those certifications have changed? You kind of alluded to the fact that they were a lot more, we took those at face value previously, but it seems like that's becoming less and less of a thing. How have businesses' relationships to those changed? And does that impact businesses' relationships to a voluntary outcomes-based framework like the CSF?
Yeah. Well, when you're talking about, SSAE 18, SOC 2,
Yep.
Those are audited controls. And so an objective third party has come in to check your work. The NIST framework is voluntary and it's, can be self-assess.
Right.
So, one of the ways this is changing is they've given us a tool that makes this easy and cheaper. A SOC 2, low end is going to be $25,000, $30,000 a year.
Right.
You can do a CSF assessment yourself and save a whole bunch of money and have basically the same outcome.
Right.
I think that the best use of the CSF and leaning into all this guidance we're getting from everywhere is to use it as not so much alignment with a framework, but turn it into a risk assessment tool, right? Yes. Because those things are different, right? If we see, it's outcome based, right? So it doesn't say have this specific control in place. It says make this thing happen, right? So remote access is managed.
Yep.
Okay. We're not doing that. Well, you can do that by shutting down your firewall for remote access. And every time the phone rings and a vendor wants in or an employee wants in, you open up the firewall for them. That's a way to do it. You're doing it, right?
Yep.
If you're Lockheed, you're going to have a better solution than that. But still, that's not risk. A gap in a control is not risk. You have to ask yourself, what is the likelihood of a bad outcome based on failure to meet that, that control objective, and what would the impact of that be? That way you turn it to risk. Okay, so we don't manage remote access. People come and go. We don't know what's going on.
Right.
What's the likelihood that you could have unauthorized disclosure of protected records, theft, right? Business email compromise, extortion, ransomware, denial of service, be used as the third party to attack others, or just get knocked down for the sake of getting knocked down, right? Wipers are starting to show up all over the place because of the geopolitical conflicts going on.
Right.
Okay, there's 5 business outcomes, right? Don't talk to executives about scary Russian cyber buffer overflow, right? You talk to them about these 5 business outcomes because they all cost money. Yep. So if you turn a gap, okay, we don't meet the control objective, into the likelihood of one of those things and know what the impact of that is, now you've got an identified risk. And so they want you to take that identified risk. And this is where they could have done a little better with the framework is add, likelihood and impact estimates there, right? Like you guys have done with your CyberStrong tool, right? And that way you take that risk to a committee and say, we have a gap here. Our recommendation is that we mitigate this through the application of controls, and it's going to cost some money, right? There's only 4 things you can do with risk: accept, avoid, mitigate, or transfer through insurance, right? So you go to the committee, you say, well, we're going to need some money for this. We want to make that committee is perfectly fine to say, we're going to accept that risk.
Right.
But now you need to have executive fingerprints on that decision. Right. So again, there's a lot of things that fit together here. And the guidance that has come from Health and Human Services for the healthcare sector, we want board level representation, cybersecurity advice to be given at the board level. We want executive membership in risk management decisions, things like this. And if you get all these things to go together, you're doing it right. And there are some carrots that are evolving for doing it right. And we all know what the stick is, right? We're I mentioned negligence, and people are getting accused of this fairly routinely now. But there are safe harbors emerging. So if you've used the tool, okay, and you have aligned yourself with the framework and you're managing your way through these risks and you've taken it to your committee and you get flattened with ransomware, okay, this is a foreseeable event. That they're calling cybercrime the 3rd largest economy in the world. It's only going to get bigger. You're not going to go glove to glove with the 3rd largest economy in the world and win.
Right.
So, but if something happens, this foreseeable event,
Mhm.
and they come in and they go, well, you were doing everything we were supposed to do. We are going to ensure that the private right of action does not apply. And what does that mean? It means you can't just, based on the fact that your record was disclosed, can't hold up your hand and say, you didn't do a good job protecting my data. I am now a plaintiff in a class action suit.
Right.
That's the safe harbor. And there is legislation currently in Florida where they are considering this. I think one other state has already adopted this. I think it might be Connecticut.
It was Connecticut. Yep.
It was, okay.
That came out for 1.1 and like
memory's still working. All right. But if this proliferates, right, all of a sudden you've got this really good reason to use this very specific tool, which is outcome-based, can apply to any size organization, is not prescriptive,
right,
and then provides this safe harbor for you. You're doing it right.
Yes. And so I wanted to just circle back very quick and button up the kind of more prescriptive certificate-based frameworks quickly. It sounds like, kind of based on what you said, the biggest shift that we're seeing is a higher degree of symbiosis between the CSF and these prescriptive frameworks, in the sense that, to your point, so like waving around a SOC 2 isn't going to cut it anymore. And so you need to be able to back that up with a more risk-based approach that the CSF enables. And
you said that way better than me.
That's why the big bucks, Mike. And so with that, it's much more of it's a tighter relationship than what we've seen previously between these prescriptive certificates versus the outcome-based CSF. Whereas, I think for the past 6 years, correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of the way that I think that the community thought about the CSF, especially when 1.1 came out, was it was kind of almost like a blueprint. We saw a bunch of frameworks come out that pulled language from the CSF and almost assigned controls to it. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think NYDFS did, that was kind of that was something very similar, where there was a lot of corollary language. And to your point, this shift is almost kind of pulling the CSF out of the background, and kind of less of just pure foundation for more prescriptive frameworks, and actually enabling it to be to your point, a tool that embeds within the kind of certification process of the business ecosystem.
Yes, and it's interesting that you brought up DFS. So I'm gonna go tangential here for just a second, because I think what New York has done is pretty smart. So again, the sector-specific regulatory agencies, okay, Health and Human Services for healthcare, EPA does water. So they've all been given this guidance. Everybody wants, governance, board representation, right? Third-party risk management, all of these things. And what we saw was the EPA, so the Coast Guard went to the ports and they said, okay, we're your sector-specific regulatory agency. Through the rulemaking process, we would now like you to supply a risk assessment, a cyber risk assessment, along with your facilities security plan that you have to submit, I think, every 2 years.
Right.
It's like, okay, we'll do that. The EPA said exactly the same thing to the water sector. Said, along with your sanitary survey, which you now are already required to supply, we want a cyber risk assessment. 3 states sued and made a back off. Right. And so now it is more of a conversation with the water sector and the federal government and other stakeholders, trying to come up with what are acceptable controls that we can all agree to. All right. So that is a demonstration of how the limitations of this method the federal government is using, right? There can be pushback, and there's already pushback on, Health and Human Services and some of the guidance coming out, because it's too much, right? The CPGs, the cybersecurity performance goals, and something called the hiccup, right? It's like they're getting guidance from everywhere. It needs to be consolidated down. Right. Well, so what we saw was there is a limitation to this method, and what DFS did, and the state of New York in particular, is adopted a lot of the same regulatory stance that's coming out for the critical sectors, but they did it at a state level. And the reason is because we all see what's going on in Congress, and politics blows the other way, regulations get undone, and New York, I think smartly, said, okay, we're going to do this at state level, and we're just going to ignore all this federal dysfunction. We'll handle it. And I think that was great. But again, the tools, the NIST CSF still is the right tool to use.
Right.
And if you think about, you're not regulated at all, right? You don't take credit cards, you don't have health records,
Right.
you don't produce energy, you don't have law enforcement information, anything like that. You're a lumber yard, okay? Sure. You still got to get insurance.
Yeah.
Okay. So insurance companies have become the de facto regulators of everyone. And if you are using the CSF and you have, looked at your controls, found what your gaps are, budgeted out what it's, given yourself a 2-year roadmap for corrective actions, your insurance company is going to view that very favorably. And in fact, if there's an event and they're going to come in, what happens? The smoke jumpers come in with Q-tips and toothpicks, and they're going to find every way possible to deny your claim. But if you've done that, you're going to be in much better shape. So the tool then is for everybody to use.
Right.
And, along with some of the smart things that New York has done, I think insurance companies are also pushing for this methodology to be implemented because, they need to price risk better.
Right. So you alluded earlier to kind of the behavioral economics that we're seeing with some of these new regulations. And obviously, the EPA, HHS, you mentioned, but I wanted the other one that definitely, we have just gotten back from RSA, and the other big one that's hanging over a lot of folks' heads right now is the SEC. The thing that kind of really ties that together, to your point, is this idea of increasing the amount of carrots, because we can't necessarily afford an increase amount. We can't afford more sticks at this point.
Yeah.
So to that end, looking at these regulations, especially kind of when you look at the SEC, the goal of it being to increase transparency, and almost, again, to your point, with kind of these civil suits and almost using, again, the behavioral economics to fuel improved cybersecurity instead of giving these prescriptive control lists. How does the CSF fit in kind of, just to kind of focus this? I know we've touched on a lot of different pieces, but I want to assemble it a little bit. How does the CSF 2.0 fit into the rise of these new regulations, kind of designed to increase transparency and focus on outcomes more so, instead of kind of just checking the compliance box?
Yeah, I think it's because if you are overly prescriptive, right, it becomes onerous.
Right.
If you are left to your own methods, whatever those may be, right, a small nonprofit, and I run a small nonprofit, right, Pisces, right, you're not going to be able to do the same things that the Bank of America or some enterprise level company can do. So they've made it so that it can percolate all the way down to the smallest organization, even if you have to hand roll a lot of things. And I think that's being viewed with a lot less trepidation than some of these really prescriptive standards, right? NIST 800-53 or 800-171 are very prescriptive, right? The SOC 2 is prescriptive, but if you know the process, you create your own scope for that. Right. You're going to say, here is, where our trust principle is going to be confidentiality or security or whatever. And here is the scope of what's in the audit. And finance's laptop over there is not in scope. And so you're allowed to create that. That's still a whole lot of work. And it's very, because it's audited by a third party, it's also a little onerous on the business, right? It's disruptive. We're going through ours right now, and it's not a fun time. So I think, in terms of the behavioral aspects of this, they're making it easy, right? I mean, we have the worst secret handshake language in this business, right? All this cyber nonsense, right? You gotta boil this down and make this so that people can operate a tool like that without having the knowledge of all the secret handshake language or all of the process that you have to go through for the very prescriptive frameworks. If you're regulated, the payment card industry, for example, sorry, it is what it is. But again, if you are way down that supply chain, this tool is for you. So I think that's the behavioral aspect right there. It's the easy button.
Yep. So with the kind of, we'll call it like the economization of cybersecurity, the application of market or indirect incentives, we'll call them, such as you mentioned, the safe harbor laws that we're starting to kind of see come back into vogue, as rather than kind of these fines for non-compliance. To what extent do you think that the updates from 2.0, and we're going to kind of get into the nuts and bolts in a little bit here around some of the updates, but do you think that the updates that 2.0 brought to the CSF align the framework for broader adoption and kind of meet that scalability requirement that you were alluding to, as far as kind of being able to reach down and kind of hit the the mom and pop lumber shop versus like the Lockheeds of the world?
Yeah, I think it's going to take still a while longer to get down to the lumber yards.
Of course.
Right. And again, that, could be fairly well driven by insurance companies. I do think, and it has been my observation, and in fact, I've, participated in a lot of this, we're seeing a lot of uptake of the CSF by local governments, hospitals are starting to use the CSF as the basis for their HIPAA risk assessments. And so I think it's hitting the I would call that mid-market pretty well.
Right.
And in fact, one of the things that's assisting that is, so specifically in local government, but also hospital districts, the state local cyber grant program is in effect right now. In fact, here in Washington State, we're in round 2. So there's $5 million out there, for whatever you got to buy, do a incident response plan, tabletop exercise, whatever. To get your grant application approved, it is very helpful if you have assessed yourself against a framework, one that the federal government is advocating is a real good choice, and say, based on those results, here's what we're asking for in the grant. We're using it to inform our grant requests. So in fact, in a lot of, I used to work in local government. I was the CISO for the city of Seattle. And so I know a lot of folks in local government around here. And round 1 of the grant, they said, okay, we would like to get an assessment against the NIST framework. And so the grant paid for that. And then round 2, which is a larger round, based on the results of that assessment, here's what we'd like to ask for this time. So they've given us this tool, they've given it the easy button. It is reaching down into the mid-market. It's being driven up by insurance companies, but it's also very useful in another carrot is the federal government, coming up with these grant funds to help security controls and critical infrastructure. Local government is really critical. So they're going to do this again soon. This is proposed. I don't know where it is legislatively, but there I think is $800 million that they're going to free up for the healthcare sector. Because our hospitals are getting killed. So
certainly.
Use the same process, right? I need some money for assessment against the tool you gave us. Okay, the results from the tool you gave us say that we need this stuff, so now we're asking for this. Get into that battle rhythm, all that works.
So I know we're definitely over the halfway mark here. So I want to get into some of the nuts and bolts as far as kind of some of the updates to the framework and kind of what folks, who have adopted the framework as adopted 1.1, considering the shift, and kind of dive into some of the dive more substantively into some of the changes. So with that, we have touched on a lot around the addition of the 6th function, govern. What benefits / kind of impact should we expect to see from the 6th function, or adding it at that level? Obviously, again, it's kind of been pulled out of identify and made its own tier. What do you think the impacts of that are going to be?
Well, it's giving everybody a recipe for how to do it right. And so as you go through this, wow, we don't have a risk governance committee, right? That's a gap. Okay. Well, that protects you from claims of negligence. That is going to be viewed favorably. You brought up the SEC a minute ago, and everybody, all the SSRAs are coming out with their old mandatory reporting thing, right? CERCIA is the one that encompasses all critical infrastructure, right? So Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act, right? And it's in the comment period right now. Eventually, that's going to apply to everybody that can be considered critical infrastructure. But if you're not well versed in risk management and how you need to have this governance function there, it's starting to come out from the SSRAs.
Right.
So for example, the SEC, they came out and what sucked all the air out of the room was they said, well, we're going to have 4-day mandatory reporting. It was, 4-day reporting. We don't even know what's going on after 4 days. Okay. That's what, kind of took everybody's imagination. But if you read through the whole thing, they really leaned into governance there.
Yep.
All right. Now that's for publicly traded corporations, which may or may not be critical infrastructure. I don't know if Google is critical infrastructure. Maybe it is.
Depends on who you ask, I think.
Yeah. But, all these things are starting to align here. And the CSF is the recipe for how to do these things. So the agencies are saying, do this. The CSF says, here's how.
Right. So with that, the other element that has really jumped out is kind of the shifts to the changes to the tiers and scoring model. Can you touch on, a little bit about that and kind of what, if you could, kind of peer into your crystal ball for a minute, why were those changes? Why the changes to the scoring model?
I actually don't think that's such a big change, to tell you the truth. And when I got to tell you, so I use the CSF to do our risk assessment here.
Yep.
We use your tool to do it. And when we score ourselves, remember, the CSF is not a risk assessment. Right. You guys turned it into a risk assessment. So the scoring tiers are a little, embedded in the tool for me. Right. So I don't think I can really comment cogently about the differences there. But the fact that I can estimate the likelihood of a bad event based on the failure to meet a control objective, and then kind of parameterize what I think that would cost, that is the scoring I am interested in right there. Right. So the tiers and how granular they get, you can go all the way down to a prescriptive level, right? With the CSF. I don't recommend it, unless you are, Boeing and you have to be compliant with CMMC at level 3, right? Then that's when it gets really prescriptive. Yep. I think it's also handy that the ability to crosswalk between the CSF and some of the other standards of practice, that makes it super handy, because that can be your tool of reference. And then the PCI auditors show up, you create a PCI report for them. And again, it's the easy button. So, you guys have kind of hidden all the scoring stuff from me as a user of your tool. But
we've certainly always had dynamic scoring in the platform. So it's to your point, that's always been kind of that's one of our bigger selling points of the CyberStrong platform previously, has been kind of the dynamic nature of our ability to customize the scoring models based on what customers are looking for. So it's interesting that you bring up the fact that it's never been kind of a fundamental shift just from the ease of use of the product in general. To zoom out and kind of look at the product for a minute too, I think that's something that's really been interesting to see is the alignment of the CSF. And to your point about kind of aligning the CSF around risk, it's not necessarily the way that we had approached and obviously, not going to do as cogent a job about explaining this as Patrick could, but the connection from controls to risk is always something that's been very kind of differentiating for us, as far as kind of being able to take that and almost, again, use the CSF as that kind of Rosetta Stone that was the original thesis of the framework, or one of the original theses of kind of being able to take that and translate it into other form factors, but also align it with business needs. And to your point, kind of communicate cybersecurity posture upstairs in a more clear-cut way.
Yeah. So here's what they want you to do, right? They want you to inform the board of directors, or if you're in local government, your county commission or your city council, right? And so being able to very easily create executive level presentation material for that. Here's where risk is concentrated. Clearly, there is an opportunity for improving our resilience controls, right? We're not doing so good at, respond, recover, right? Those domains. And that really, again, just makes it super easy to be compliant or consistent with the guidance that's coming out of sector-specific agencies and cascading down all the way into all manner of businesses, just because everybody needs to see everybody else's security papers before they do business now.
Right.
And in fact, every year, right? I mean, so again, leaning into the pieces of the CSF, that are more on supply chain or third party security,
Yep.
that's all about show your papers, man. And we are there. Security is a competitive differentiator now, and that's provable. But just based on everybody else's inspection of your business and what insurance companies are doing and everything that we see in the news, what happens on the bad side of it.
So I want to talk a little bit about, again, going back to the voluntary nature of the CSF. We spent a lot of time talking about the changes here. What about the updates from 1.1 to 2.0 change or increase the reasons why teams should leverage the framework?
Well, I think that the carrot of a safe harbor is a pretty strong draw. The ability to very rapidly produce materials that your business associates are all asking for is a pretty big deal. The favorable impact that has not only on insurance premiums, but the willingness of your insurance company to actually honor a claim when something happens, because stuff is going to happen. So it's I think a really good tool to prepare for what is likely to be an inevitable act. Right? It's going to happen. And so it's a way to control impact of something like that, right? You're going to get hit with something. It doesn't have to be the end of your business. You don't get fined out of existence. You're not going to get a class action suit. You're still going to deal with stuff like customer flight, possible, additional regulatory scrutiny, things like that. But you have limited the impact. And so I think that makes it a pretty good tool for uptake by just about everyone. Who would voluntarily go, I think I'll just pick up the ISO standard? You're not going to do that.
Right.
You have to be forced to do that. Largely, if you're going to do business in Europe or India, that's the only reason to do that. Nobody would voluntarily pick up NIST 800-53. It's this much paper. It's crazy. But the NIST framework is a friendly tool.
Right.
I mean, hey, do you make this thing happen? Well, let's see. Do we? Can we? And it's doesn't have all of the expense or disruption of a third-party audit where they're coming in, they're actually produce an artifact that proves that this control is in place and effective. That's a very invasive process. So the easy button, the safe harbors, positive impact on insurance, something that you can use to demonstrate your security to your business associates, those are all drivers for uptake.
Right. And with the addition of the govern function, I think that a bigger challenge with V1.1, to your point about that a lot of those things are kind of the just core value of the CSF in general, right? But I think that especially the narrative that I heard in what you had just said was around going, whether if you're looking to resource the adoption of the CSF and you're kind of going to your CFO, you're going to your CEO to say, we need to do this, and here's X, Y, and Z, why. There's a growing body of examples and evidence to say we should be doing everything to kind of mitigate our reputational risk, at least. That said, up until kind of the addition of the govern function, it was very hard to kind of get the CISO and the rest of the executive leadership on the same team, because the CISO was driving the adoption. There was no kind of prescription or objective within the CSF that kind of pulled business leaders into the process. Whereas now, with the addition of the govern function, you not only have this whole body of evidence to support why you should adopt it, but you also, to your point, have a roadmap for how to get your CEO, your CFO, your board involved in the adoption and invested in communicating through the CSF.
Yes, right. So to restate a little better, not what you said, because that was perfect, but what I said. I don't think it's the change to the CSF itself that's driving the adoption. I think it's the events going on around us, the scrutiny we're getting from our partners, right? And just the fact that it's this handy tool to address a whole lot of these, issues and minimize that impact of, a foreseeable event. So, the changes are all aligned with the guidance coming out of sector-specific agencies.
Right.
They're all starting to say the same thing. They're all getting on the same page about governance and third-party stuff, right? Board representation. Everybody is being very consistent here. And so some of the updates to the tool are to be aligned with what's coming out of the rulemaking process there. Right. But I think it's more self-preservation for business that's driving the uptake.
Right. And I think that, to kind of go back to the CyberStrong product for a quick second, like, you look at the way that the CSF exists within CyberStrong, right? It is not, it's again, it doesn't come with its own control set. So you're kind of, this is kind of this interpretable Rosetta Stone layer on top of, it is this Rosetta Stone layer on top of whatever frameworks you're working with. And so again, it's kind of that element of being able to build on top of whatever you're already doing. And so with that, being able to pull in your board, your CEO, your CFO, whatever, from a governance perspective is so much more enabling with that, and kind of being able to layer that together. So as far as kind of looking at implementations, what have you seen organizations go through, and what can organizations expect when making the shift from 1.1 or 1.0 to 2.0? We've spent a lot of time focusing on some of the bigger shifts, but what have you seen come in the short amount of time that that 2.0 has been out? What shifts have you seen at organizations that have committed to implementing it?
Yeah, really only one. And I've heard this from a few folks, is that if you're doing it right, you're doing a risk assessment annually. Okay. And what you would like to do is have, a durable set of information in there that can be compared year on year. And so the addition of the new domain and moving some parts of others into others and expanding some makes it a little more difficult to do that year-on-year comparison. But actually the feedback I've gotten has been really good. We're really glad that the governance domain has been added, because to your point, it allows us to bring the executives in, and now we all discuss risk like we should have been doing all this time. Right. And we have a methodical way of going through this, and with our executives at the table, everybody is well informed. There's no surprises, and thank God they just don't say that's IT's job anymore.
Right.
Right. Yep. So I think some folks that I've spoken with are happy that this has given some insulation to them, so that they are not solely responsible for some of the decisions being made or some of the failures to get things funded, because that has the tendency to snap back on them, when there's one of these events. And now they appreciate the new domain. Right. Again, the only kind of, criticism I've heard is, well, now we have to kind of start over gathering our data for this year-on-year comparison.
Right.
And that was just a little disjoint, but it's not a big deal.
Fair enough. Well, I know we're almost at time here, but I'm sure we could keep going between the two of us. Any parting thoughts from you, Mike, and any last minute, while we let any last minute questions trickle in? I got one question, but I'm kind of saving it for the last minute here. So unless we have any last questions to come through, any parting thoughts from you, Mike?
I would say that if you want to pick up the CSF and just dig into it and start using it, that's great. Remember, though, it is not a risk management framework, and you have to make it that. So you have to add elements of likelihood and impact, and be able to just like do high, medium, low. Right. If you don't use the CyberStrong tool or some other GRC tool, you can use a spreadsheet. I have a spreadsheet. I'll give it to you. Does the spider charts and all that stuff. It's not as good as CyberStrong, but pick it up, use it, and you will very rapidly start to bring your executives to heel.
For sure. Awesome. Well said. Albeit, definitely use CyberStrong, not spreadsheets. My goodness, I want to invite you back. So last parting question here, a little kind of a field, but definitely I think worth worth answering. Can a Google cybersecurity certification be enough for someone to become an entry-level security analyst, in your opinion?
In my opinion, yes. Okay, so I'm really going to answer this question.
Yep.
So today, you can go get your bright new shiny degree in cybersecurity, but if you get your pedigree the way I got mine, you're going to go to prison. Okay, so back in the day, if you're OG, there was no school, there was no degree, there were really no certifications, there was nothing like that. You had to be curious and you had to take risk. And so at CI, we value your curiosity, what kind of network you experiment on at home, how willing are you to take a little bit of risk? Have you scanned Morgan Stanley's perimeter? Because we think that's a good thing. And routinely now, there are articles coming out talking about how we're doing this hiring thing all wrong. There is no shortage of cybersecurity professionals. Our expectations are absurd. If you want an entry-level analyst, you can't require a degree, a certification, and boots on the ground experience. It's not going to work. Right. And this is one of the reasons. This is what Pisces is about, the nonprofit I talked about that I founded. Public Infrastructure Security Cyber Education System. We do free, no-cost monitoring of local governments. Use the metadata we collect as live fire curriculum for 20 universities across the country. So people are getting this operational experience while they're looking at real events in critical infrastructure. That's great. That's a great differentiator. However, it's more about your curiosity. People can get into this business from I'm a geologist. Those degrees right there, that's geology, chemistry, and oceanography. Wow. Right? Anybody can get into this, but got to be curious. You probably need to self-study a bit. You need to start throwing up virtual systems and start, running a monitoring stack at home. Use ZenMap, figure out what's on your network. You'll be amazed. That is much more relevant. So the answer is yes. That certification is perfectly fine to get your foot in the door. Just remember, have some answers to those questions about curiosity and your home network and your willingness to take risk.
Well said. No, I think awesome. Great way to wrap up there. Appreciate the time here, Mike. This has been a very, very dynamic conversation. I've been excited for this one for a couple of weeks. So I, appreciate the time. If anyone in the audience is interested in learning more about the way that we've put the CSF into CyberStrong, feel free to visit us, cybersaint.io, or email us info@cybersaint.io. We'd love to hear from you. Mike, thank you so much for the time. We look forward to having you back.
All right, Ethan. It was a good time. Thanks for the chat, man.